Hello everyone. As always, I want to give a special shout out to my dear subscribers, those who give me constant support and love the horror stories that I write myself. I would also like to ask those who are on the channel for the first time to like this video and subscribe to the channel so that our creepy community grows and scary stories reach a wider circle of people who love creepypasta horror stories. For tonight, I wrote a story about a haunted house. I'm eager to find out if you like it. Let me know in the comments. Enjoy the creepy story and stay until the end to find out how it all ended. My father passed away because of tea. It sounds crazy, I know, but after spending months watching a strong man become a shadow of himself, you start to notice patterns. Gabrielle Shepherd was always there with her cup, that dark green concoction that smelled like decay beneath the sweetness. I was a sophomore in college when she started coming around our house on Hill Street in Castle Rock more often. After my mother died, Gabrielle would coincidentally stop by to check on Dad. At first, it was once a month, then every week, and then every day. Dad, who used to be the sharpest bank manager in 3 counties, started looking at her like she was a walking sun. "She's so caring," he'd tell me during my rare visits home. "Just like your mother." But my mother never cast shadows that seemed wrong in the corners of the room. She never had that empty look behind her eyes that would appear when Gabrielle thought no one was watching. That fall, I came home for wisdom teeth removal. Gabrielle was practically living at our house already, transforming it from a warm place filled with Mom's antique furniture into something sterile and cold. "It's better for your father not to have too many things around that remind him of the past," she explained, as she put away the last of my mother's photos. I was lying on the couch in the living room, still groggy from the medication, when I first saw something that shouldn't have been possible. Gabrielle was standing next to Dad's armchair, leaning over to adjust his blanket. The late afternoon sun was casting shadows across the Persian rug. Her shadow moved in the opposite direction of her body, stretching towards Dad's neck like a tentacle. I blinked, attributing it to the Percocet in my system. But then I started noticing other things. Dad was getting weaker and weaker. His sharp mind, which used to solve the Times crossword in under an hour, now struggled to follow the plot of simple TV shows. His hands trembled as he held the mug of Gabrielle's tea. "It's just stress," Gabrielle would say, when I mentioned his confusion. "My special tea helped. Old family recipe." Her smile never reached her eyes, those pale blue orbs that looked too old for her otherwise young face. One night, I woke up to the sound of voices from Dad's study. Gabrielle's words were too quiet for me to understand, but Dad's voice was clear. "Something's wrong. I can't remember." "Just drink some more tea, honey," I heard her say. "Everything will be all right." The next morning, Dad couldn't remember the conversation. In fact, he didn't seem to remember much at all. He sat in his armchair, staring blankly as Gabrielle poured him another cup of her tea. I started doing some research, digging around online for any information about Gabrielle Shepherd. Before her employment at the hospital 5 years ago, it was like she didn't exist. Perfect references, perfect background, too perfect. 2 months later, Dad had lost another 20 pounds. The house grew colder, even though the heating was running full blast. The shadows in the corners looked deeper, denser. "Your father and I have some wonderful news," Gabrielle announced one evening at dinner. Her shadow on the dining room wall looked too tall, her arms reaching towards the ceiling like grasping branches. "We're getting married." Dad smiled blankly, nodding as Gabrielle described their plans for a small ceremony. I watched him struggle with his fork, noticing how his hands shook worse than ever. The man who taught me chess, who built science fair projects with me, who ran a family financial empire with a razor-sharp mind, could barely hold a utensil. That night, I snuck into Dad's study, searching for anything that might explain his sudden decline. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a false bottom he'd shown me years ago, I found a stack of medical reports, blood tests, cognitive assessments, toxicology reports, all showing a steady deterioration. I heard the floor creak behind me and turned around. Gabrielle was standing in the doorway, her figure silhouetted by the hallway light. But her shadow on the study wall showed something else. A shape that was almost human, but not quite. The limbs too long, the movements too fluid. "You shouldn't be snooping through your father's private things, Maynard," she said softly. "It's disrespectful." "What are you doing to him?" I demanded, holding up the medical reports. She smiled, and for a moment, just a moment, her teeth looked wrong. Too many, too sharp. "I'm taking care of him, just like I took care of your mother, just like I've taken care of so many others who needed me." "Others?" "Go to sleep now, Maynard," she whispered, and her shadow lunged forward even though she didn't move. The last thing I remember before darkness overtook me was the smell of that sweet rotten tea and the feeling of something cold and ancient wrapping around my consciousness like a shroud. I woke up in my own bed the next morning with a headache and no memory of how I got there. The medical reports were gone from Dad's study, and when I tried to tell him what I'd found, he just looked at me blankly before asking if I'd like to try some of Gabrielle's special tea. 2 weeks later, Dad was dead. The doctors called it early onset dementia, complicated by a sudden stroke, but I knew better. I saw Gabrielle at the funeral, dressed in tasteful black, accepting condolences with perfectly practiced grief. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that Dad's death was only the beginning. In his will, he left most of his money to Gabrielle, his beloved nurse and companion, but the house, our Victorian on Hill Street, he left to me. The look in Gabrielle's eyes when the lawyer read that part of the will still haunts me. For a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped, and I saw something ancient and hungry beneath. That's when I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. What happened next would make me question everything I thought I knew about reality, about memory, about the thin line between life and death. But most of all, it would make me wonder what kind of creature Gabrielle Shepherd really was, and how many others like her are out there, waiting, their shadows stretching across time itself. The house on Hill Street no longer smelled like home. That was the first thing I noticed when I got back from a business trip to Boston. Instead of Mom's old lavender potpourri and Dad's Dunhill tobacco, the air was heavy with incense and something sharp, metallic, like blood mixed with copper. Daniel Alger, my old high school buddy, who now worked as a real estate agent, warned me not to leave Gabriel alone in the house for so long. "Things happen when you're not around, May," he said. "People talk." But I had to go. The new position at Thermocom Industries didn't leave any room for negotiating business trips. I was gone for 6 weeks. Long enough for Gabrielle to completely nest in my house with her new boyfriend, Victor. Tall, skinny guy, with eyes like a dead fish, and a smile that never reached past his lips. A guy who wore gloves even in the middle of July. "Maynard, honey," Gabrielle gushed out of the kitchen as soon as I walked in, her voice sweet as poison honey. "We weren't expecting you so early." Of course you weren't, I thought. That was the plan. "The last meeting got cancelled," I lied, putting my bag down in the hallway. Something was different about the hallway. The wallpaper. It was the same Victorian wallpaper Mum had picked out 15 years ago, but the pattern seemed kind of shifted, like the flowers were twisting when you weren't looking at them. Victor appeared from the living room, wiping his hands with a cloth that looked suspiciously red. "Ah, young Mr. Hawkins," he drawled with a slight Eastern European accent. "We were just talking about you." "Did I interrupt something?" I asked, pointing at the cloth. "Oh, this?" Victor chuckled. "Just a little restoration work. I have a hobby, you know, collecting." Before I could ask what exactly he collected, Gabrielle changed the subject. "Are you hungry, dear?" "I just made my special tea." "No," I interrupted sharply. "I just want to rest. It was a long flight. I headed upstairs to my old room. But something was off. The stairs, there were more of them than there should have been. I counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 17. Our house always had 15 steps to the second floor. Always. My room was at the end of the hall, the third door on the right. That's how it had been for 22 years of my life. But when I got to the third door, there was a bathroom behind it. My room was somehow at the end of the hall, behind a door that wasn't there last month. "Oh, we moved a few things around while you were gone," Gabrielle called up from downstairs, like she was reading my mind. "Victor is very good at reorganizing spaces." I opened the door to my room and almost threw up. The walls were covered in small wooden boxes, hundreds of them, all the same size, all arranged in concentric circles. In the center of the room stood my old bed, but the sheets were new, dark red, with gold embroidery that looked like ancient runes. "My collection," Victor said behind me, so close I could feel his breath on my neck. It wasn't warm. Each box contains a special memory. He reached past me and took a box off the wall. It was old, the wood darkened with age. The name Elizabeth Maddox, 1847, was engraved on the lid. "Don't open," I started, but Victor was already lifting the lid. A melody filled the room, the same one Mom's music box used to play, the one Gabrielle gifted to someone a few months ago. But this wasn't just sound. With the music came a feeling, the perfect happiness of a summer day. Mom's smile as she showed me how to prune roses, the smell of earth and sunshine and love. And then it was all gone, sucked back into the box when Victor closed the lid. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he whispered. "Your mother had such wonderful memories. Too bad they're gone now." I turned to hit him, but Victor was already gone. I stood alone in the room full of boxes, each labelled with a name and a date. Some were hundreds of years old. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch in the living room, refusing to go back to that horror room. I could hear them moving around upstairs, Victor and Gabrielle, their footsteps somehow wrong, like they were walking on the ceiling instead of the floor. The next morning, I went to the municipal archives. It only took me a few hours to find the pattern. Elizabeth Maddox disappeared in 1847 from her home in Castle Rock. Her husband reported that she had been getting increasingly confused in the months before her disappearance. The nurse who cared for her also disappeared. I dug deeper. I found more cases. Every few decades, the same pattern. A wealthy family, illness. A nurse who appears out of nowhere. Death, disappearance. And always a mention of tea that helped with the confusion. When I got home that evening, Gabrielle was waiting for me in the living room. "I know what you're doing," she said, not turning to look at me. Her shadow on the wall was twisted, distorted into something with too many limbs and too many angles. "You know, your father was also curious at first, before he learned to simply forget." "What are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking. "I'm a keeper of memories, Maynard. Victor and I, we're collectors. We preserve people's most precious memories, their happiest moments, their love, their joy." She turned to face me, and her face was no longer human. "And we feed on them. You're a monster. I'm a survivor," she said, "for centuries. And you know what? Your father gave me all his money, but you got the house." She stood up, her shadow stretching across the entire wall. "But that can be changed. Everything can be changed. As you may have noticed, things in this house are not quite fixed." The room around us began to change, the walls writhing like living flesh, the floors rippled beneath my feet. "You see," Gabrielle continued, "this house is special. It always has been. Why do you think Victor and I chose it? Why do you think I spent so much time preparing your father? This place, it amplifies our abilities. It makes us stronger." She reached out towards me, her fingers elongating into claws. "And now, dear stepson, I think it's time you tried some of the tea too. There are things that neither Harvard nor MIT can teach you about the exorcism of memories. Trust me, I spent 3 days in the Miskatonic University Library, reading books that should have been locked away. I learned that old beliefs aren't just stories. There are creatures that feed on our happiest moments, turning joy into fuel for their immortality. But what really scared me wasn't Gabrielle or her collector lover Victor. It was the realization that my house on Hill Street wasn't just a building. It was a gateway. I had 3 days before Gabrielle and Victor got back from their honeymoon in the Czech Republic. 3 days to save not only the house, but also the thousands of stolen memories trapped in their damn boxes. "You're a freaking chemist," I told myself as I mixed substances in the basement. "Think." The ancient texts spoke of pure fire. A fire that can burn what isn't of this world. I needed something stronger than ordinary flames. Something that could burn the very shadows themselves. Thermochem Industries didn't give me the keys to their lab for nothing. I worked for 3 nights straight, combining the knowledge of modern chemistry with recipes from forbidden books. The result was a liquid that shimmered like mercury, but burned with a cold, white flame that didn't cast shadows. I started with Victor's collection. Each box was a small prison for stolen happiness. Elizabeth Maddox, 1847. Thomas Grady, 1923. Sarah Chen, 1956. Sarah, my mother. I saw the date on one of the boxes, the day before the cancer started. Oldest first, I whispered, following the instructions from the books. I started with Elizabeth Maddox's box. I dripped a drop of my mixture on it and spoke the words I'd learned. The wood began to glow from within, then crumbled into moonlit ash. A wisp of smoke rose from the ashes, forming into the shape of a young woman who smiled at me before fading away. One by one, I freed the trapped souls and memories. Some were centuries old, others only a few years. Each carried a fragment of stolen happiness that returned to the world. But the house was fighting me. The walls bled a black liquid that smelled like Gabriel's tea. Doors slammed shut and opened on their own. The stairs changed their number and direction. At one point, I found myself walking on the ceiling, gravity inverted as in a nightmare. And then I found my father's box. It was new, the wood still fresh. His name and the date were engraved on the lid. The day Gabriel first brought her special tea. Inside was everything. His love for Mom, our fishing trips, the chess games, the first time he taught me to drive. When I opened that box, I heard his voice. "Hurry, son. She's coming." The house shuddered. There was a scream-like sound in the walls. Gabrielle knew. Somehow she knew what I was doing, and she was coming back. I hurried through the remaining boxes, working faster than I thought possible. Each released soul weakened the grip that Gabrielle and Victor had on the house. The walls stopped bleeding. The rooms returned to their proper places. I was on the last box when the front door burst open. Gabrielle stood there, no longer even trying to maintain a human appearance. Her shadow spread across the foyer like a black lake, and faces emerged from it, thousands of faces of those she had cared for over the centuries. "You little brat," she shrieked in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices in agony. "Do you know what you've done? These are our memories, our food." Victor appeared behind her, his gloves gone, revealing hands that were more claws than fingers. "We should have killed him right away," he hissed. I held up the last box, the one with my mother's name. "Don't you dare," Gabrielle threatened. "You know what's ironic?" I said, holding my mixture in the other hand. "You're a nurse. You should know that some poisons, in the right doses, can be a cure." I poured the liquid over the box and spoke the final words of the ritual. With a scream that shattered all the windows in the house, Gabrielle lunged up the stairs at me, her shadow morphing into a storm of claws and teeth. But it was too late. The light that exploded from my mother's box was like a sunrise. In it, I saw every happy moment that Gabriel had stolen, not just from my family, but from all families throughout the ages. Every stolen joy, every snatched smile, every lost moment of love, all were released at once. Gabriel and Victor vanished in that light, their bodies melting like wax, their shadows burned to nothingness. The last thing I heard was Victor's scream. "What have you done to us? I gave you what you gave others. I said as they disappeared. Eternity. Just not the kind you expected. When the light faded, the house on Hill Street was just a house. Old and a little run down, but clean. On the floor lay 2 small wooden boxes, freshly carved. One read Gabriel Shepherd, the other Victor Dvorak. I picked up the boxes and headed towards my father's safe, but something stopped me. The weight in my hands was wrong. I opened Gabriel's box and found her diary inside. The first page was from 1847, written in the hand of Elizabeth Maddox. Dear Diary, I have found a way to survive. There is a creature that feeds on memories, but I can trick it. I just have to become like it. I closed the box and looked in the hallway mirror. My reflection smiled, even though I didn't. Its shadow was a little too long, a little too dark. Some chains cannot be broken. Some hunger cannot be sated. Not forever anyway. I picked up a mug from the table. The tea was still warm.